On May 23, 1950, the nation of South Africa celebrated the 80th birthday of one of its founding fathers, Jan Smuts. A diplomat, soldier, and visionary, Smuts, as the only man to sign both the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I and the Paris Peace Treaty that brought an end to World War II, was a voice for democracy and freedom.
He is a South African who has put South Africa on the map.
And I ask you, all of you, to signify your feelings by giving him the acclamation which his character, his life's work, equally deserve.
Smuts also helped draft the Charter of the United Nations.
We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to reaffirm the dignity and worth of the human person in the equal rights of men and women and of nations.
But back in South Africa, Smuts's policies were anything but forward-thinking.
Internationally, Smuts was able to appeal to the best in his hearers and to draw them as allies in this great idealistic campaign for freedom and democracy and human rights. In South Africa, he always spoke with a forked tongue.
If there is one tragedy of South African 20th century history, it is that this man, with his extraordinary gifts and insight and charisma, did not use that charisma to push for a more inclusive racial vision when it could have saved the country decades of trauma and strife.
In the mid-1600s, the Dutch East India Company, with one of the largest fleets in the world, dominated the trade of spices and silk between Europe and Asia. The company needed a safe port for their ships as they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and they set one up at Table Bay. Employees of the company, looking for a better life, soon began moving inland and colonizing the area. And over the next 2 centuries, this small, passionate group of Dutch colonists, known as Afrikaners, developed their own unique culture and exploited the native African population.
Slaveholding was quite extensive in the Afrikaner farming population. I think about 1/2 at least owned at least one slave, which is more extensive than the American South.
Most Afrikaners were farmers, called boers in their language of Afrikaans, and they no longer identified themselves as European.
The term Afrikaner had been used from the beginning of the 19th century to describe the Dutch-speaking inhabitants who had already been in Africa for quite a few generations. And by the end of the 19th century, there was quite a strong Afrikaner nationalism.
Afrikaners considered South Africa as the land that God had chosen for them, and they were in South Africa to stay.
But they were not alone. The British were also in southern Africa to stay. They'd arrived in the area in the 1700s, and they shared a conflicted history with the Afrikaners. They'd fought over control of the port in the Cape Colony, and they'd battled over the independence of the Afrikaner republics.
The British looked down upon the Afrikaners. The Afrikaners were unwashed peasants from the hinterland. The only ones below them were the Africans. And the British were these civilized, so-called civilized and well-dressed, fashionable people.
But the discovery that underneath their feet lay a source of wealth beyond comprehension turned their highly charged relationship into a powder keg. Enormous gold and diamond deposits were unearthed in the Afrikaner republics, and the British Empire wanted control over this new source of capital.
South Africa established itself in the minds of the world in terms of its wealth. When you have gold and you have diamonds and you have a beautiful land. That is what establishes itself in the minds of people. South Africa was a land of dreams. It had all this wealth, and everybody wanted to get their hands on that wealth one way or the other.
In October of 1899, the British Empire went to war against the Afrikaners, committing 450,000 troops to the Boer War, as it became known. Despite having an army less than 1/4 the size, the Afrikaners kept the British at bay, and a war that Great Britain anticipated would take only a few months stretched on for years. The Afrikaners staged dramatic guerrilla raids, destroying British railroads and confiscating British supplies. The leaders of these raids became Afrikaner heroes, and one of the most notorious and resourceful was 29-year-old Jan Smuts.
Perhaps his most dramatic escapade was to take something like 300 commandos on a lightning raid where he really tied up British troops for quite a long time, and he gained enormous admiration, I think, for his audacity.
But only a few years earlier, fighting the British was the last thing on Smuts's mind. In 1891, this seventh-generation Afrikaner left his family's farm for England to study at Cambridge University.
Smuts is that rare human being in South Africa who was an Afrikaner, but who was imbued with the gentility and the scholarly tendencies of Cambridge University. So he was a new South African human being, both with the Afrikaner spirit and with the gumption to be as good as a British gentleman.
On his return to South Africa in 1895, Smuts married, started a family, and became involved in Afrikaner politics. When the Boer War threatened, Smuts attempted to resolve the dispute peacefully.
He yearned for peace. He did not want to go to war. He always felt that there was an alternative to war. But when war became inevitable, he saddled up his horse, literally, and fought the war.
Increasingly frustrated, the British adopted strategies meant to crush Afrikaner resistance. They trained and armed some 20,000 native Africans.
The spectre of a large number of armed Africans was a truly terrifying prospect. Smuts himself wrote one of his most impassioned and viscerally racist letters at the beginning of 1902 about the dangers this posed to the future of a white South Africa.
Natives and colored people as armed combatants in thousands. The fiends committed horrible atrocities on peaceful women and children. Dark indeed is that shadow. When Boer women have to cook for and serve the brutal colored scouts and are forced to listen to their filthy talk, that is a wound to South Africa which time itself will not heal.
During the Boer War, the British developed another strategy which proved even more horrifying. They took up a scorched earth policy, destroying thousands of Afrikaner homes and farms.
They rounded up the Boers' farmers' wives, children, put them in concentration camps. That's when that vexed expression first enters the English language, and burnt down the farmhouses, literally.
As many as 30,000 Afrikaner women and children died of starvation and disease in British concentration camps.
Smuts said late in his life that the only people that he ever hated in his entire life were the British during the Boer War.
Nevertheless, after 3 years of warfare and the deaths of nearly 40,000 Afrikaner soldiers and civilians, Smuts set aside his bitterness and recommended what was best, he felt, for the Afrikaner people.
To say, look, this has now gone far enough, we can't fight any further. If we continue any longer, the very future of Afrikanerdom would be threatened. And the time had come to make peace.
In 1902, Smuts, the guerrilla commando, began a new chapter in his life as a diplomat, persuading his fellow Afrikaners to accept that their future was to become part of the British Empire.
Brothers, we resolve to stand to the bitter end. Let us admit like men that the end has come for us, has come in a more bitter form than we had ever thought possible. Perhaps it is God's will to lead the people of South Africa through defeat and humiliation, yea, even through the valley of the shadow of death, to a better future and brighter day.
I think Smuts, after the war, had a really far-sighted understanding of the British character with regard to the war. Because of his days at Cambridge, he was in touch with Liberal Party opinion in the UK, and he realized that there had been massive opposition to the war within British society.
Capitalizing on that opposition, Smuts became the architect of a peace settlement, and on May 31st, 1902, the treaty ending the Boer War and making the Afrikaner republics part of the British Empire was signed. Smuts persuaded the British that the question of voting rights for native Africans was one that should be answered later, by Afrikaners. The foregone conclusion was that Afrikaners would never grant native Africans the right to vote.
Smuts had an absolute blind spot about black South Africans. He regarded their destiny as separate from that of whites, and that was an early sign of Smuts's racial agenda. By keeping the vote to whites only, he was ensuring a perpetual Afrikaner majority, because if black people had been able to get the vote, the Afrikaners would not have retained a numerical majority. So it was quite a shrewd political move, as much as anything else, to insist that the vote be retained for whites only.
Both the Afrikaners and the British used the blacks when it suited them. On one hand, they were using them for their own ends in their rivalry. On the other hand, they were mutually, I think, and subconsciously agreed on the necessity, to diminish the strength of the blacks.
Native African families were prevented from moving freely around the country. Many lived in simple thatched huts, and their children were undernourished and uneducated.
In this whole scheme of things, of course, the blacks are at the bottom of the pole altogether. They are just thought of in terms of labor units and how they can advance the fortunes of the whites.
In 1905, Smuts was instrumental in the formation of the Hetvolk, or People's Party. Its mission was Afrikaner self-government. He collaborated with a popular Afrikaner general who had also served in the Boer War, Louis Botha.
In a sense, this was a winning partnership. Botha, as it were, dealing with the Afrikaners, Smuts talking to the British. It proved an unbeatable combination.
On May 31st, 1910, the Union of South Africa became a reality. Smuts spearheaded the drafting of the new nation's constitution.
Smuts's goals for South Africa, I think, ultimately rested on his determination that it should represent an outpost of civilization in a barbaric continent. Clearly, the word civilization was a code word. It meant white domination.
The unification of the four republics in 1910 was the final betrayal of the blacks in South Africa. It was about white power. It was about compromise between the British and the Afrikaners. It was a great thing for white people in South Africa, but for blacks, it merely entrenched their enslavement in South Africa.
Of its nearly 6 million inhabitants, whites made up only 22% of the population.
One of the perplexing things about Smuts was here is this really brilliant man who, when confronted with what was termed at the time the native problem, says, I can't think about that. It's a Sphinx-like problem. There's something very odd about that withdrawal. And I think it partly arises out of that contradiction in himself between his conscious articulation of a doctrine of freedom and independence and his unconscious fears of what that would mean for white South Africans.
Louis Botha, appointed South Africa's first prime minister, called on Smuts to serve as both Minister of Finance and Defense in his newly formed cabinet. But in August 1914, decisions made in England commandeered South African politics. The British Empire entered the First World War against Germany and its allies, and as part of the British Empire, South Africa was also at war. In East Africa, the British were being humiliated by the smaller German army that was successfully using guerrilla tactics against them. And Smuts, a former guerrilla himself, was put in charge of tracking down the Germans and capturing their wily and evasive leader, General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. Smuts had von Lettow on the run, but before he could complete his mission, Smuts, as South Africa's most experienced diplomat, was sent to London to represent his country at a conference to plot the future of the British Empire. And it was here that Smuts came to the attention of British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Impressed with Smuts's skills as both a military strategist and resourceful negotiator, Lloyd George insisted that Smuts remain in London as part of the British War Cabinet.
During the First World War, Smuts really established South Africa as an international player, way above the size of its population or its real capacity in terms of resources.
Smuts took charge of the development of the Royal Air Force and offered strategic advice for the battle on the Western Front. And he was held in such high esteem that during the war, the British took to calling him the handyman of the empire. With victory in 1918, Smuts remained in Europe, becoming one of the founders of a new organization dedicated to peace, human rights, and democracy around the world, the League of Nations. But what Smuts was willing to stand up for internationally, he was unwilling to support back in South Africa.
His embracing of human rights, his embracing of peace, he's becoming one of the architects of the League of Nations. All of those, it's almost like you're dealing with somebody who is schizophrenic, who can handle high policy, high-sounding international policy, but is not able to apply it among his own people.
In 1919, just 3 weeks after Smuts's return home, Prime Minister Botha died, and over the objections of some Afrikaners, Smuts was chosen as his successor. 49-year-old Jan Smuts was now Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa, and Smuts's government continued to cement white South African privilege and power at the expense of the black population. Laws were passed that prevented blacks from taking some semi-skilled jobs and from receiving higher salaries than whites. And segregation was legalized in South Africa's cities, where blacks were forced to carry government-issued identification.
Can you imagine if he had advocated for the rights of blacks at that time? How that would have played? It would have been a disaster. Maybe we would not have the stable South Africa we have today. I don't know, It might have led to a country that was perpetually at war. But by saying so, one also seems to be justifying the length of time it took for change to take place.
There were times, however, when Smuts overlooked the concerns of the white Afrikaner working man in favor of British corporate interests.
There was a strike in 1922 that really convulsed the area for about 2 months. And in the end, the government bombed the strikers, with planes. And about 250 whites died. And Smuts was the person who put that down. He didn't draw back from using extreme violence.
He was ruthless in putting down striking white workers. He was as ruthless, if not even more ruthless, in putting down black opposition. And I suppose he'd learnt that ruthlessness in hard wartime situations and saw it as part of being a decisive leader.
There was always a very ambivalent feeling among Afrikaners towards Smuts. He was always greatly admired for his intellectual power, for his brain, for his vision. But they were always suspicious towards him that he may compromise South African interests for the sake of keeping South Africa part of the British Empire.
Smuts paid a price for what some considered his divided loyalties. In 1924, South Africans voted the 54-year-old out of office and replaced him with James Hertzog, an Afrikaner friend of the working class who was also a hardline white supremacist. For the next 9 years, Smuts, on the sidelines of South African politics, led the opposition party. But in 1933, the worldwide depression made it essential that for the good of their country, Smuts and Hertzog put aside their differences and form a coalition government. Then, in 1939, Adolf Hitler invaded Poland. The world was once again at war, and Jan Smuts was back on the world stage. Prime Minister Hertzog insisted that South Africa remain neutral. Smuts challenged him and spoke out in favor of global freedom and democracy.
Young South Africa, come forward and move on to the battlefronts. Unite for victory.
For many people, the fact that Smuts was prepared to take South Africa into the war in 1939 was very important. And in a sense, that image of Smuts valiantly taking the South Africans to war in the face of bitter internal opposition made that his finest moment.
When South Africa's parliament sided with Smuts, Hertzog resigned in protest. And Jan Smuts, now 70 years old, was once again made South Africa's prime minister. Just as he'd been during World War I, Smuts became a trusted and valued advisor to the British during World War II. Prime Minister Winston Churchill urgently summoned Smuts to London for advice and counsel. In 1942, in a speech broadcast throughout Great Britain, Smuts addressed the combined Houses of Parliament.
This, in the last analysis, is what this war is about. Persecution, domination, suppression, enslavement of the free human spirit, extermination. These are the dominant features of the new creed as practiced in the occupied countries.
While the war raged on, the United Nations, a new organization to promote international cooperation, was being created. And just as he had with the League of Nations, Smuts became an early supporter. He flew to San Francisco, where he helped write the charter and define the spirit of the new organization. But this was to be the last international gathering that Smuts was to attend with an untarnished reputation. A growing awareness of German atrocities committed against the Jews during the war was leading nations to examine the consequences of racism, and South Africa's policies would soon come under that microscope.
As Smuts himself said, by the 1940s, colour queered his pitch everywhere. South Africa was already becoming embattled, particularly in the United Nations, which Smuts found a hard pill to swallow.
The race conflict in the Union of South Africa is creating a dangerous and explosive
The
situation.
doctrine of racial differentiation and superiority is extremely dangerous to internal peace and international relations.
Meanwhile, in 1945, as World War II came to an end, a beleaguered Smuts returned to South Africa where racial tensions were mounting. Black South Africans were organizing, spurred on by the African National Congress, a party dedicated to securing rights for native Africans, while white South Africans, who composed only about 1/5 of the population, were determined to maintain their supremacy over the blacks. But even in this political climate, Smuts was certain he knew what was best for his country.
On one side, I am a humanist. On the other, I am a South African European, proud of our heritage and proud of the clean European society we have built up in South Africa, and which I am determined not to see lost in the black pool of Africa.
In some ways, he often spoke the words of a liberal, but there's always this undercurrent, and every now and then the visceral racism really pops out.
Smuts's policies reflected his racial prejudice, but compared to his opposition in the election of 1948, Smuts was viewed as a liberal.
The National Party drummed up this incredible new catchphrase, apartheid. The idea that systematic legislative segregation should be introduced in all spheres of life between whites and blacks.
Under apartheid, marriage and sexual relations between whites and blacks would become illegal, and whites-only signs in public facilities would become ubiquitous in South African cities.
Smuts totally underestimated the power of this concept of apartheid. And so it came as a surprise when in the 1948 elections, Smuts lost.
Was it for him a shock? Absolutely. He did not expect to lose it. I think he acknowledged possibly that there were certain aspects of South African politics and in fact South African makeup that he had ignored or not paid sufficient attention to.
Late in his career, Smuts realized that the integration of black and whites was a reality. He said that to try and take black people out of the cities of South Africa would be as wishful thinking as trying to sweep the ocean back with a broom. And many people took this as a sign that Smuts was prepared to introduce major changes. Well, it was not to be.
Have you any idea what caused the change of heart in the electors?
Oh, it's the post-war desire for change, you know. People don't like the old faces and the old voices and the old smiles and the old speeches. They want to change. Why not?
Yes,
They have it. I hope they'll be happy.
At the age of 78, Jan Smuts was out of office. His political life was over. The era of apartheid would begin. Just 2 years later, Smuts died, never having seen the full impact of the apartheid policy, which grew to include police repression, territorial separation, and more than 350 laws limiting the rights of South Africa's black citizens. Consumed by hatred and violence, South Africa became a pariah to many in the international community. The tide turned in 1994 when the era of apartheid came to an end. Nelson Mandela, a leader in the African National Congress who'd been imprisoned by the apartheid government for 27 years, was elected the first black South African president.
It's interesting that there has been a revival of interest in Smuts since South Africa's re-established its respectability in international eyes after the years of sanctions and isolation. But To be absolutely cynical, people don't actually know what Smuts did and what he stood for in South African politics, and that even black South Africans share in this myth that all was well before 1948. If only Smuts had won, the whole thing would have been different. And I would suggest that it would only have been marginally different.
Maybe we are hard on Smuts because we expect that with the intelligence that he had a possibility, to be actually remembered in the terms that Mandela is remembered in. But you cannot escape being judged. You can't go halfway. You have to take the risks. I think personally, unfortunately, when he thought all those wonderful thoughts, he was making a distinction between, the world of thought, the world of ethics, and the real world where people live.
Singwaskapeni mama, singwaskapeni, asengamala, onombai benopatu, onombai benopatula, onombai benopatu, 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 Bas Georgia.